Hi, I'm Caryn Coleman. I am the founder of The Future of Film is Female, which is an organization that amplifies the work of all women and non-binary filmmakers through our short film fund, our commitment to exhibition, and our community building programs. It should be no secret by now that we are also huge horror lovers and that we support genre works whenever we can in our programming. And we're delighted to continue our Future of Horror is Female conversations today as we look at the merging of folklore and horror. And as always, try to explore and unpack what happens when women start telling the horror stories that have previously not been told by them. So please welcome, we have Kate Dolan, the writer and director of You Are Not My Mother. Emma Tammi, Emma Tammi, the director of The Wind, which was written by Teresa Sutherland, and Laura Casabe, who is the co-writer and director of RETURED. Hello, hi. Welcome. Hi. From literally all over the world, we are here. Yeah. So I want to start because I know all of your films had great festival runs. Kate's film is not released yet. The Wind came out a few years ago. So I figure it might be a good idea to start off by just giving a brief synopsis of what your film is about, and perhaps maybe a little bit about your work too, but just like a log line so people have a point of reference if they haven't seen it yet.
Mm-hmm. Will I go?
Go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, so You Are Not My Mother is kind of a psychological horror film, I suppose. It's about a teenage girl who lives with her mother and her grandmother, and one day her mother goes missing on the week leading up to Halloween in Ireland, and the family fear the worst at first, but then she returns, but her behavior becomes increasingly strange, and the young teenage protagonist learns some truths about her family and what things that have happened to them in the past. And it culminates on Halloween night, and it's coming out on the 25th of March in the US, I believe.
Emma?
I'm like, I want to watch it. Tell me more. I'm hooked. The Wind is also a psychological horror / thriller. It's also a Western, and it's based on true stories of women at the turn of the century claiming insanity after being on the prairie, oftentimes by themselves for months and years on end, and hearing the incessant howling of the wind. That was the inspiration of the story that then Teresa Sutherland, as you mentioned, wrote it, took into supernatural places towards the end of the film. So, yeah.
Cool.
Is it in her head or is it a demon? You know, the age-old
classic.
Right. Okay.
Yes.
Well, the RETURED, it's a story that happens in Misiones. It's a part of Argentina, in the part of the forest of Argentina, during the first part of the 20th century. And it's a story about a family who has people that work there with yerba mate, that work in slavery conditions. And well, something about the protagonist, it's a woman that has this child, and something is in the forest that she doesn't know what is going on, but it's weird, it's kind of haunting her. And one day this child disappears, and well, what happens then, story explains why this child disappeared and develops a whole story that happened during the past that explains everything you see in the present. And it's kind of a folklore story fusion with a historic drama. Something like that.
Oh.
Well, all of your descriptions lead to this thing that we talk about in every conversation. And Laura, I think when you were in the panel that we did for Night Stream, this was the first time we really talked about genre fluidity and this idea that filmmakers, and particularly filmmakers that I'm sort of looking at, like 2014 with The Babadook, that there is no straight idea of like, this is a horror film. And it works with other genres to kind of create this next chapter of horror, which I find very exciting, and kind of challenges this, like, every film's a slasher film that should be horror films. But my question to you, it's a hard one, but why horror films? And, you know, how and why do you like to use them in your stories? We can keep doing the circle if you want.
I think I really think horror is, as a filmmaker, it's just like a really creative place to be working, because you can kind of let your imagination run wild and create things and monsters and, you know, worlds that you might not see in a drama film or, you know, another kind of genre. And I think I feel like for me in horror, you can like depict themes and, like, you know, discuss themes that would be much too confronting in a drama film or even a thriller movie, that you can kind of bury it under a level of horror that then it makes it more kind of more fun, I suppose, and more palatable for an audience, that they can enjoy it. So I think, yeah, that's mainly why it appeals to me, but also I just like to scare people as well.
That's a good answer. But Emma, The Wind is so interesting to me because it is all these things, but it's also such a beautiful Western. And I just kind of want to get your take on combining those kind of psychological horror elements with this kind of vast American landscape. They marry perfectly. It's just,
yeah, it was. It's funny because the Western side of the movie was the part that was like a little bit more predictable in terms of my own personal attachment to the material. Not that I didn't grow up loving horror films, I totally did, but I really, really loved Westerns. And on top of that, these actual dramatic stories that Teresa was using as inspiration had been something that I had been fascinated with as a teenager. And I had like read the book that she had used as source material. And this was just all kind of, you know, kismet and coincidence. But I really discovered the horror throughout the process, if you will. Like I got how bleak and devastating and horrific these experiences were in real life. But, you know, as Kate pointed out, like it can be bleak and it can be not so fun to watch those stories sometimes. Not that they, you know, don't have merit and value, but I felt like the entry into horror and blending it with the Western component of that film and the dramatic component of that film allowed me to go into weirder spaces and allowed the character to go into weirder spaces that felt universal and timeless, even though it was a period piece. And I really kind of like fell in love with the genre as a creator in a way that I wasn't expecting. And now pretty much every project that I'm working on is at least dipping its toes into horror, thriller, dark. And, you know, I think that's, it's also such a great genre blend. I mean, you can really add a touch of that to pretty much anything, right? And so it's an exciting space to dance in and try to reinvent and have flexibility with.
Well, for me to take what Emma was talking about, I also grew up watching horror stories, but I do believe the best horror stories, or for me, the best ones were the ones, I always thought that horror is kind of interesting in a way when you blend it with something else, you know. And I think that horror, it's kind of, or the way I think about it, it's like in a language, you know. For me, it's a language to tell a story about something else. For example, I do love Possession, Zulansky movie, or Rosemary's Baby. If you talk about Possession, for example, is the story about a horrifying breakup of a couple and a horrifying man, you know, and you have like a real, you know, psychological drama. But of course, then you have the monster, and then you have the horror, and for me to use the language of horror to talk about in my movie of a historical melodrama in that part of our country, I think that is the way that I see horror, that I kind of understand horror, and for me, it's the way that is more interesting. Not as a theme, more like a language or a point of view. If you know, it's something that, and for example, you know, here for me, it's like important. I do understand. I do love horror movies. But for me, to talking about the story of Latin America in particular and Argentina in particular, that it's also a really violent story, you know. Well, actually, my movie talks about colonization, and we have like that was, of course, we are a country of the third world, and that is for me really horrifying. You know, if you go down to the street and you see people, you know, living in the streets and everything, and that for me it's interesting to talk about horror. It's interesting to use horror to talk for me about Latin American horror things, about, for example, the horror of being poor. That it's something that for me in our country, that we have like, you know, the middle class is always really close to the lower class, and we have crisis and everything, and that could happen anytime. Well, that for me, you know, it's so horrifying that happens, that horror, you know, the language of horror movies, it's really useful for me to talk about this. And of course, I also take what Kate was saying, because maybe if you talk about these things with a drama, would be so horrible, you know, so hard to deal with it. But if you put it in a horror movie, maybe it's a way to dance with it, that you can, you know, give another level of deal with it. I don't know. I'm sorry about my English. Of course, when I do this, I always
It makes
Perfect.
but I don't, you know. So that is for me. And yes, I do believe that it's a good time, you know, to finally, you know, Jen, that is what's going on with horror right now. It's really, really interesting. So that is for me what's happened with the genre fluidity. But as I told you, the best movies of horror for me are, in a way, you know, gender fluid. You know, so that is, you know, for me, horror, it's like a language. Though I always grew up watching horror movies, and as Kate said, I do love to get to be scared and to make people.
Yeah, I think there has to be that element of I want to scare the pants off you. But you know, and I think, you know, I was telling Kate a little earlier that with the world that we're living in right now is such an interesting time to make horror and to digest it, and how we haven't really kind of seen how we can read that language of horror like this in such a long time, at least for in the States, of, you know, the films in the 70s dealing with Vietnam. They were very intense and violent, and it came home. And I think, you know, while films are being made about, you know, the potential of a world war coming, we're reading these things. There's still moments that lead up to it that you're kind of looking at horror as a guide and a release. I never really considered horror very cathartic, but I am now.
No, I do think that horror, to make, for me, you know, this is a friend that says this, so I want to quote her, but she says that horror, for her to make horror, is kind of an exorcism, you know, at some point, and that I also think that, you know, in what you were saying there, Caryn.
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, kind of why you use horror is the one question, and then now we're going to go like down another level of how like folklore and because folk horror seems to be this like enduring element of genre films, and it is something that threads all of your films together, and it has a lot to do with place. You know, we have the prairie madness in the American West, we have possession and indigenous culture, we have you know, a changeling in Ireland, which is so interesting to me because I've been reading these like books from the 1970s, and it's like changelings just like kept coming up. And then I saw your movie and I was like, are changelings having a moment? Like what, what is going on with the changeling? But I just wanted to know, and like, how did folklore influence these stories, or is it something that sort of has always influenced your work and you're now incorporating it into it?
I think, like, you know, in Ireland anyway, like our folklore is very much, it permeates really into our culture a lot. Like when you're told all the stories of, you know, changelings, or don't step into a fairy ring, or the fairies will take you, kind of stuff, like that's told to you as if it's real when you're a kid here. You know what I mean? It's not kind of a fairy tale. And that really kind of sticks with you. And I think in Ireland, we, you know, despite being under kind of intense Catholic rule for many years, what precedes that is paganism and this kind of pagan belief system. And I think we're never too far from that at all times. So I think it's very much part of my DNA anyway, that kind of storytelling and that kind of pagan belief system, and that the folklore elements. But I mean, I think that like horror it's really just kind of an extension of the fairy tale, because horror movies to me are very allegorical. So they're representing something else. And that's like very much to me like what fairy tales do. So, you know, I think they're just kind of like, they're probably the closest thing to that kind of folklore story or a fairy tale that we have now, maybe. But that's just my opinion.
Well, I think what's interesting about You Are Not My Mother is that we have the changeling, and I don't know how many people are familiar with this, but you know, usually it's the child that gets taken, right? And
yeah.
then
Well, actually, interestingly enough, the last recorded changeling in Ireland was in 1895, and that, well, recorded changeling, so it wasn't actually a changeling, probably. But that was a woman called Bridget Cleary, and her husband thought she was a changeling, and he burned her in a fire, because the fire is seen as cleansing to like get the changeling out of the body and like bring whoever it is back. And yeah, so he basically murdered her. But she was a fully grown woman. So I think there traditionally in folklore it is babies that are swapped. But I think in Ireland anyway, there was definitely lots of cases of adults as well, and who were thought to be fairy folk or whatever they thought it was.
That's an intense aside.
Yeah.
Well, Emma, you talked a bit about the Prairie Madness, and I was trying to find today, I had the tract that you all IFC had made for your film, which was like the
demon pamphlet.
The demon pamphlet. I have it. I just, when I left my office, I securely put it somewhere.
Oh, I don't have one within reach,
but I wanted to like bust it out for you.
Oh, so sweet of you to still have it. Yeah, I mean, Teresa really brought, I mean, all the demons that are mentioned in the movie are real, and we don't go into like deep demon mythology, but you know, she was calling from that bed of knowledge, which was really fun, because she had done a deep dive in that. But really, we were using folklore as an extension of religion. And then when I stepped onto the film, I added a backstory for our protagonist, Lizzie, that she in fact was an immigrant and who had come from Germany and was probably bringing a whole other kind of set of folklore and myth as well as religion with her. But it's such an interesting time because, and I was thinking about this morning, like in terms of modern day folklore and how even just I personally relate to it right now, because I think there was a period of time, and this is certainly more where the wind falls in, where like, you know, people were trying to make sense of the world in ways that science wasn't explaining yet, and the news wasn't explaining yet. And, you know, the dissemination of information was not the same as it is now, obviously. But I feel like we're still trying to figure out and make sense of the world in ways that information cannot completely explain. And you mentioned being on the brink of World War III earlier. You know, I mean, there's so much of that is also just like trying to explain the human condition, right? And how we treat one another. And so I think I have also always been really fascinated with fairy tales and mythology and folklore on a story level, because it's always felt like such fun escapism, but also often, you know, telling us something about ourselves. But I really think that we're primed for a resurgence of it right now, because of the moment that we're living through, and because things seem to continue to not make sense. So, you know, looking, I have to do one plug, and I'm just gonna pull it up so I don't botch the name, but Kirla, and I'm gonna mispronounce her last name, but Janice.
Oh, Kira Janice, yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Just made a great documentary that is like,
that's the best. It's so good.
Plug it. Plug
it's
it.
so good, you guys, right? And
Woodland
Yeah.
Days, Dark and Bewitched.
that's it.
Watch
And it's
3
on
hours of-
Shudder right now. Watch 3 hours of it.
Yes.
It's dense, 3 hours, and get riveting. Like, there's not a boring moment. I watched it in installments because it is so dense, and you do just kind of want to be taking notes of things to read and watch along the way. But it is just like this amazing resource of cool folklore to check out, and specifically in the horror space. But
I'm interested.
Yeah,
You'll love
it's
it.
really good.
You'll love it.
Yeah, I
You
could
will
have
love
watched
it.
it for 6 hours. I think I was like
Same.
enjoying it so much.
and I think she has 6 hours of footage, so we should ask for the uncut or the
Yes,
director's cut.
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. One of these days.
Yes. Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because I was going to bring that up too. Just like, it was that documentary is very interesting because there's so many ways in which
What's the name of
folklore-
the documentary? Well, then maybe I write to you and you just put it in
It's
the-
called Woodland Days, Dark and Bewitched.
Woodlands
Okay, I'm
Dark
gonna write that.
and Days.
We'll email it to you. after, too.
Woodlands, Dark and
Yeah.
Days Bewitched. Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then yeah, but it was so interesting because it really is you know, from all over the world. And that's why I think it's interesting that we have, you know, America, Ireland, Argentina, like they are, it is very personal to each location, but it's also universal, and it seems to span whatever century that you're in. You know, maybe not films, but like what they're looking at, like the, you know, the conqueror worm, you know, that's anyway, yes, that film is amazing. But how did, for you, Laura, I think it's interesting how an element of folklore is woven into this story.
Yes, well, what happened actually is that was an interesting process for me. Argentina, it's a really big country, and they have like different places. And you know, I'm from Buenos Aires, that is the capital city. So I don't have in myself no Aborigine or Indian influence at all. You know, as you know, we're a colonized country, and as well as you are, of course, and as Americans also, and well, whole continent. So my background is from Spain, from Europe, right, from Italy and everything. So the horror that I read was almost like English horror, Gothic horror, you know, would say Poe and everything, and then. But in the north of country and in the south, you have like in the forest where the Aborigines, this Guaraníes used to live, and you have like a real interest. I would say pregnancy. You know, the folklore is really intense. You know, the stories about the culture, the stories about. I would say the stories about the whole universe of Guarani people. You know, this pagan universe. Was really interesting. So when I traveled there and stayed there to write the movie, it was like a completely collides of cultures, my culture and that culture. And that of course, what was interesting for me is that the way that everything blends. So there I find in the Guarani's, I would say cosmovision or universe or goddess and all the story and pagan way of view of the world, are completely interesting stories. I would say materia. It's not the, you know, something to work with in horror, you know. And I start to investigate a lot and to read. And what happened in the movie, actually, the legend that appears in the first part of the movie is not an original Guarani legend. it's also a mix from Warrenese legend and, you know, this tale, the monkey tale, you know, the hand of the monkey. That's a classical one that you be careful with what you desire, you know. So we didn't realize, and of course I read a lot of Stephen King and I saw the movies and everything. So all my background, it's kind of completely different from the background of these people. So what happened is that we take, it's like we blend our, you know, we blend everything. And that came up, that is what we have in the movie, you know, the folklore or in the movie, it's kind of a mix between my investigation in the forest with the communities and my own personal background and the screenwriter personal background. But what I found, and I think that it was interesting, is like, you know, it was like so interesting, you know, the stories, so interesting and so horrifying, the beasts, the monsters that lies there, that you can make, you know, lots of movies. You know, some of the stories are, because it's really amazing. And since you know, these kind of cultures are really silenced and were like completely killed in our country, we don't know enough about them. So for me, it was interesting because it was like, you know, kind of take that is completely forgotten, and I didn't have that kind of education in my school when I was a child, you know. It's from my country, but it's like doesn't exist. So it was interesting the way we in that investigation, and I think that so I really want to watch the movie that you are talking about. So yeah, for me it was something like unprecedented in my life to hear and to listen about that. So it was like really easy to mix horror there in a way that I was formed about horror, you know, in that classical sense that I was telling you about.
Well, another thing, it's threaded so much throughout horror, and I love talking about it. But each of your films depicts a mother. And I think, you know, mothers are very interesting characters in horror films, particularly not just a woman who is a mother, but a mother in relationship to her child. And I know that there's like a lot to unpack individually with each of your stories about the relationship between the mother and the child, but I'd love for you to maybe talk about that relationship and sort of how you see that functioning in your films, and loss and trauma and all that good stuff that goes along with being a mom.
Yeah, well, in our film, like obviously it's kind of very much influenced by folklore and the pagan roots of Ireland. And you know, partly in my story we have 3 generations of women together, so it's like, you know, a teenage girl who's our protagonist and her mother, and then they live in the grandmother's house. But you know, these women are kind of intrinsically linked but kind of in conflict with each other all the time. And there was in paganism there's like this 3 goddess symbol, which is like one symbol altogether, but it has 3 parts, which are the maiden, the mother, and the crone. And so that was kind of inspiration for the 3 generations, that they are linked in their family, and they can't kind of not be linked, but they, you know, are also sometimes in conflict, and they have very different experiences of the world around them and how to deal with that. But also, you know, I grew up in a house with my mother and my grandmother, so it's kind of autobiographical in that way as well. But I think, yeah, it's interesting because in Ireland the mothers have had a very fraught history, like women in general. But I think we had these mother and baby homes. So if you were an unwed mother or a mother, there's somebody who is pregnant and having a baby and out of wedlock at all, you would be sent to these homes. They would take your babies from you and they would adopt them to families that were together. So that was really a part of kind of the depictions of mothers, because in Ireland we have these kind of Irish mammies that are like these mothers who like basically take care of everybody and leave everything behind just to take care of everyone. So there's very complex idea of the mother in Ireland, I think, because we have these horrible stories about mothers kind of being treated really badly, but then mothers are often kind of put on these pedestals as the ultimate caretaker. And I think it always frustrates me because I think like like my grandmother had to leave her job when she got married. It was in the law that you had to. And then it was just that you had to become a mother and a caretaker to the family, basically, in lieu of what you really wanted to do yourself. So I just, in my film, I wanted to kind of show the impact of that, I suppose, on 3 different generations of women. And the mother in the film, I think, is the antithesis of a perfect caretaker. She's like completely unable to take care of her daughter. So yeah, that was just interesting to me to kind of depict Irish women in that way, and that kind of influenced by all our history that we've had, and also hinting to the pagan elements as well. So yeah, there's a lot to unpack.
Well, with the wind, it was, I think the element that's impacting the character most is the loss of a child. And we see a glimpse of that moment, and I think I have kind of coincidentally ended up working on a bunch of projects about mothers and pregnancy specifically, which I only find kind of humorous because I am not myself. I have not yet gone through that experience. I am not yet a mother. And yet I've really gone to some dark spaces with women having babies through movies. So it's been an interesting thing to explore alongside the actresses.
So you're recording real people having babies, or you're
no. Character.
Okay.
But maybe that's the next.
I was like,
that
step is intense. But yeah,
but I'll just say, as thematically, one thing that kind of seems to touch all of these projects, and I think a lot of films that deal with pregnancy, is you really have dramatically like some of the highest highs and some of the lowest lows. And it's such an intense human experience, whether or not the child survives or does not. Obviously, very different experiences. But in The Wind, it was something that, even though we only saw it briefly, it was something that was continually impacting. We see it in a flashback. Was continually impacting our lead throughout the present day timeline, and really something that was contributing to her feeling of isolation, to her feeling of not fulfilling her role as a woman, as a wife, as someone who's supposed to be fertile and growing in a arid and desolate and in basically inhabitable prairie. So it just felt like a tie-in to the land. It felt like a tie-in to the erosion of her her relationship with her husband, and the tension that was continually building with them. So obviously infant mortality was really common back then, but I just produced at the end of last year, and we're in post now, a short film that my friend Megalyn Echikinwoke wrote and directed. And she's a first-time filmmaker, so this will be her directorial debut. And it's set present day, and it is also about infant mortality, but specifically a Black woman in the United States. And she has framed the story in also a genre framework, so that you get to go into it with some scares and some, I think we used the word fun earlier, some fun. It's manifesting in ways that let us have jump scares and be in a interesting headspace with the character that is not all just sadness and depression over this trauma that has just occurred. But anyway, that's all to say, as relevant, infant mortality is as relevant of an issue as it was back then, if not even more so, because there's no excuse for it anymore. So anyway, I don't know where I'm going with that, but I think motherhood and all the trials and tribulations of pregnancy and giving birth are always going to be like really, really prime prime topics to take on in terms of horror films, and specifically ones that women are making and want to talk about.
Well, Kate,
It's also not always talked about.
Exactly. And Kate, you mentioned something that was so interesting to me, because I have asked this question to other filmmakers, and usually the question about mothers in horror centers around birth. But you mentioned something about the relationship between a mother and child is like the most important relationship that you have, and what happens when there's like a disruption or a disconnection between that. And I thought that that was such an interesting way to talk about motherhood, whether you're dealing with mental illness or whether it's really a process of growing up, which in itself is a horror show. And I just thought that was a really interesting way to look at it.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I think yeah, I'm not sure what to say about
Yeah.
that.
You're gonna be like, yeah, I got it.
Yeah, I think yeah, I mean, like it no matter what your relationship is to your mother, or whether she's there in your life or not, or you know, whatever the circumstances are, I think there's always the strongest kind of one of the strongest kind of emotional connections or disconnections that you could possibly have. So yeah, it's
Yeah.
definitely something that will always be very emotive for a lot. Like, you know, people who've watched my film, some of them have come up to me and been like, you know, yes, I understand this. I've seen, you know, I can relate to this, and it's very affecting. So, you know, I think mothers are always going to be a very emotional topic for people to digest.
For sure.
For sure.
And Laura, your mother kind of falls somewhere in between, right? Right?
Yes. I have two mothers, a zombie one. Yeah. I know it's really hard to talk about motherhood. You know, that's the truth, because as you said, there's a lot about it. And I'm not a mother, but I do believe that, you know, that is why I do love the Rosemary's Baby. You know, this is one of the first movies that talks about what horrifying experience could also be, you know, to have to deal with the horrifying experience also. And of course, I had a character, you know, these two mothers. I want to talk about maybe one of the things that I want to talk about in the first place, in the case of Julia, that is kind of similar what Tammi was saying in that part. You know, she also has lost a child, and then she had this new child, and then further in the movie you realize it's a kidnapped child. That it's also something that it's also, I'm sorry for the spoiler, that it's something that is really close to our history also. But in this case of this woman, for me, was what Emma was saying. This is like she's so desperate to have a child in that part of the world, in this mainly world, that in the beginning of the 20th century, because it's a way to validate herself as a woman. I do believe that was the way that we thought about Julia, the character, the white woman. But also, another thing that I want to talk about is this something that has happened in our country, that is the kidnap of people, of women that were dead. You know, we have like a lot of dictatorships here in Argentina. We have a really long one, and that happens a lot. They kidnap women and men just because, you know, for political beliefs, and they murder them, and they just kept their child, and they sell or give their child to military families or wealthy families. And that is something that was really common in our, you know, 40 years ago, not so much. So that is actually what happened with this child at some point. You know, the mother, they kind of kidnap their child, though Julia doesn't know actually what happened with Kirana, the Indian, and then after zombie mother. So for me, you know, there was a question about identity at some point, you know, that it's also a question about identity that I also have in my place. Where we come from? You know, we have a kind of story that everybody told us, and then we have at this time, we have a big crisis of that story. So that for me, that is the way, or one of the readings of the, I don't know how to say this, but one of the things that I was interested to talk about in this movie. in terms of motherhood, and also about the horrible, the really excruciating experience that it could be a pregnancy, that what's happened to Julia, that you saw in the second part of the movie. And though I never had a child, though I raised a nephew, but I don't, because of circumstances of my life, but I really terrified about being pregnant. I don't think I'm ever going to be pregnant, and so there were all the things that we were talking about, and also that is interesting because I always question, taking what Kate was saying, if I ever have a child, what happens if you don't like it? If you're not, we don't have an answer for any of this, but this is why, for me, of course, and we're not going to have it and everything, but it's interesting the way that we can reflect about it in horror movies, because it's, in a way, we're saying it's kind of an exorcism at some point. So this is where the things that we're talking about in motherhood, in the motherhood issues in The Returned.
You made me think of something so interesting, because I think that one of the reasons why horror works so well is that it shows to us the unknowable, right? And being pregnant, even though a lot of people experience it, it's such an unknowable. I have been pregnant, and it is terrifying. The whole experience, it's like body horror, and your body is not your own, and then it's a lot, and then yes, you don't want your kid to be an asshole.
Or maybe you have a kind of a disconnection, we have to talk about Kevin, that I think is also a really smart story.
Yes.
And of course, it's interesting. Well, I'm sorry, I didn't interrupt you, because we have there's no answer at all, and there's no conclusion about this thing, and it's never going to be about it. But it's really healthy to talk about it at some point, so you don't feel judged, because we, as women, we have a lot to deal with. We have to do this.
We sure do.
Yeah.
I feel like I have I want to talk to you guys more about so many things, but we're running out of time. And so I like to end all of these I started doing this during the pandemic, when we were recording, to kind of bring some positive energy out to the world. Now it seems a little naive, but I still want to do it. I still want to put the energy out. And I want to know, what are you looking forward to in the future?
In life?
It's a hard question.
I mean, it could,
hard question.
It could be I'm interested in seeing Kate's film on the big screen,
Okay, yeah.
Looking
Add
forward
that to the list.
People have said going onto a beach, or this, my project, or whatever it is, just something that is actually a spot of joy coming up.
Absolutely.
A lot of joy. Yeah, well, I'm excited to have my film come out, I guess, in the US. And that's very exciting. I have a very humble Irish upbringing, so all my family are like, oh my God, an American premiere in LA. They're thinking it's so cool. So that's bringing a lot of joy to my family at the moment. So I think, I'll go with that.
That's a good one.
I think it's a really good one. Seen Kate's film on the big screen. Yes, that's a check.
Okay, we can all pick that.
Yeah. Well, I'll elaborate. So adding on to that, but in general, though, we were just talking about what festivals you've just done. I think getting back to watching movies with other people, and in theaters even, and as all of us filmmakers, hopefully having less stops and starts than the last 2 years, where I'm really just on a very fundamental level, looking forward to getting back on set, and hopeful that we're returning to, I don't want to say normalcy, but just a little bit more ammunition behind projects, and getting back up in production, and knowing how to navigate it in this new climate. So yeah, looking forward to all of that.
Laura?
And when more films coming out, sorry, because I actually do feel I totally miss international travel and being able to see new places, but I also miss being able to see new places through films And it does feel like more came out just even recently, which has been so exciting. But that, that lack of new films coming out, just like it, you just realize how our perspectives in terms of the things that we're watching, the art we're consuming, it start to get a little bit more narrow in a not so great way. So anyway, I'm excited for the, everything to start blooming. Spring, excited for spring. Fully
Yes.
rambling.
I'm so
Laura,
excited
go,
for
go.
spring. See, it's not hard. You named like 3 things. So it's like
There you
joy, joy, joy. Laura?
Well, I want to see Kate movie also. No, but also I want to, well, in a personal level, in a film, as a movie maker, I really want to. I'm just developing a movie. It's a story with based on stories about Argentinian writer that is a woman that I'm really fond of. I think it's edited. Her name is Mariana Enriquez. I totally recommended her. You can read her in London and in US also. So that is something I really hope we can make it. It's going to be really hard because it's really getting harder and harder to make movies in our country. And maybe on a personal, I also want to say that it's going to sound a little bit more like militant, but I really want to see more women direct, the woman point of view in movies. Actually, I think that what happened to me is that I think that this kind of narrative, it's over at some point. I'm really tired of watching the same women on the screen again and again. The same the models of women, and I think it's really, I think it's really urgent to change that, and it's really urgent to have more like movies. So for me, it's really interesting to be legal, the fact that you can have, to make a legislation about it, actually, because it's really important because it's made everything, the way that my head is being kind of, I don't say moldeada, but the way I think is because I saw a lot of movies that were directed by white men. So it's really important to change that at some point. And though the world is like shitty and it's going to be, and we are maybe in the urge of a third world war or something like that. We don't know. I don't know. But I do believe that maybe in gender, it's like really something interesting going on, and the way that we think about family. I'm having, this experience about, my life, that something happened that I raised my nephew with my father and my mother and her mother and a lot of friends, and we are like a family that is completely different from a regular one. Yeah. And I realized that is going to start to happen. Communities are going to change the way of they think about relationships, and we think about motherhood and fatherhood and friends and love, and everything is starting to change. And for me, it's going to be joy in that. It's going to be a little more generous. And I kind of hope that, and I do think that I hope of course, it's always going to be a shitty world. I think that, but we are living in, as Mark Fisher say, like capitalism realness is our reality. It's not a system. It's our reality. But I think that we also have the power to change that. Maybe in our private old world, and we can make our people think different. And of course, I think that it's going to be, women making movies is going to be a big part of it. I really think this.
I think that's wonderful. It's a perfect way for us to end this conversation. I want to thank Kate, Emma, Laura. Thank you so much for talking about your work, and I hope that we can talk about it again. I keep saying I am not your mother because I am a mom. You are not my mother. Opens on March 25th in the US. Where can we watch The Wind?
Oh, that's a great question. I think it's on Netflix at the moment.
Okay.
I think so.
And where can we watch The Returned?
The Returned, it's on Amazon, but in Latin America and Europe. But right now, someone in the US acquired the RETURED. So I think that maybe, there's going to be some place to watch it. I
Well,
don't know.
I'm looking forward to screening it at some point in New York.
Please.
That's I will
love
let
to go
everyone know. Well, thank you so much, and thanks everybody for watching.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Caryn.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you guys.
Yeah.